Many years ago, I separated from my boyfriend and entered a time of great heartache. I knew in my heart that he was the one for me, so this really was a desert season in my life. But in this desert, God showed up. The desert is useful. What really was happening was God was thwarting my idol, my desire for a relationship. I had desired this above him, but I hadn't known that. At this time, I was in a Bible study and we were reading a book that was really talking about one chapter in particular was talking about God manifesting his presence in our lives, and they called it romancing, God romancing us. I didn't want to read this chapter because the thought of having to resort to God romancing me over a man, I literally did this. But despite my childish behavior, my Bible study encouraged me to give it a try. So the next day during my quiet time, which I call my coffee times because I've always bonded with God over coffee, I always talk to him with a cup of coffee in my hand. But I said, okay, God, romance me. I did it in a very resorting type of way. Well, that day after work, I had decided in my gloom to treat myself to something. This was around the time when single cup coffee makers had just come out. So I was going to go buy one, and despite what it cost, I was determined just to buy myself one. So I price checked and I settled on one that was $49.99. I picked up some other stuff in the store, and I just knew I was going to spend over $100, but I didn't care. I headed to the register, and everything was rung up, and they turned to me and they were like $38.95. And I point to the coffee maker and I'm like, did you get that? And they kind of did this thing to find out what it cost, and it was $4. You should have seen the expression on my face. God bought me a coffee maker. I knew it was the Lord. Well, after that, I went back a few days later and I found that same coffee maker for $2 each, and I bought 3 more. So I ended up with 4 coffee makers for around $10. And of course, I didn't need that many coffee makers, so I ended up giving them away. But what God ended up showing me is that when he gives in abundance, and he gives so that we can make ourselves a blessing. So I was able to bless others. So God romanced me. He did it. He showed up. And there's so many stories that came after this where God continued to show up, to where my favorite verse became one at the end of Job, where Job says, my ears had heard of you before, but now my eyes have seen you. He went through a desert and came to this conclusion, and I went through a desert and came to this conclusion. God turned my theoretical faith into practical faith. I didn't just hear about God. I began to actually see his hand in my life. It was a lot of fun. God wants to manifest his presence in your lives. We just have to, in faith, ask him to show up and romance us, or manifest his presence, however you want to put it. But God desires to give us stories worth testifying about, so that I actually just read this in Matthew 10. You have been given freely, so freely give. And that really impacted me. God has given me an abundance of stories, so I now want to freely give them to you, so that you will in turn ask God to start showing up in your life in the same way, because he also wants you to freely give through the word of your testimony. I hope you're encouraged today.